Alrighty. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the San Anselmo Racial Equity and San Anselmo Public Libraries program this evening. Our Author Spotlight series, a virtual conversation with Dr. Brittany Friedman. I'm Sariana, the Adult Services Librarian at the San Anselmo Library, and before we begin, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library and the Library Parcel Tax for supporting this program. Town Books, the Friends of the Library's bookstore, is located at 411 San Anselmo Avenue. It's in the back of the courtyard building. They are open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., and proceeds benefit the San Anselmo Public Library for programs like this, materials, and equipment, so please check them out. Technology can be very fickle, and I want to thank you all in advance for your patience and understanding during this program. We are encouraging everyone to turn on their video and show their faces during tonight's presentation, and participants can unmute themselves for questions at the end of the presentation. Or you can put all your questions in the chat box and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. Please join me in welcoming San Anselmo Racial Equity Committee member Tiffany McElroy.
Thank you. Thank you, Sariana. So happy to be here tonight. I'm Tiffany McElroy, part of the Racial Equity Committee in San Anselmo, as Sariana said, and super excited for you all to get to hear and learn from Dr. Brittany Friedman. But first, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we are gathered is the occupied, seized, stolen, ancestral, traditional land territory of the coastal Miwok people. And moving on, I want to just give you a little bit of background on Dr. Friedman. Dr. Friedman is a sociologist and assistant professor at the University of Southern California, where she studies race, incarceration, and systems of political repression. She's the author of Carceral Apartheid: How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons. It explores how the United States prison systems, especially in California, used segregation and white supremacist alliances to suppress Black political activism. A co-founder of the Captive Money Lab, her work sheds light on how incarceration is financially and ideologically weaponized. Friedman is known for her investigative sociology approach to truth-telling through deep archival and institutional research. So everyone who's here, I'd like to welcome Dr. Friedman. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you so much. Wow, what an introduction, Tiffany. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's lovely to be here this evening. You have lots of choices of where you come during your evenings, and I am glad that you're here with me and that we're here together. So thank you all very much. I would love to, I'm going to share my screen just so that I have that up here and you can see this image. I love images, so I have images to share, and don't worry, there won't be, lots of words on the screen. It's not my style. But I am, very happy to be here. Thank you for sharing this community space. I would consider this a ceremony space, right? It's a container that you intentionally create for people to show up, to be vulnerable, to share ideas, and I love those spaces. I also love libraries. I'm a child of the library. I literally like growing up in the early 90s and mid 90s and early 2000s was like the little kid with the whatever Matilda had when she's pulling all her books, that was me. So I, I love intellectual spaces. But I'm also very grateful. I want to thank Tiffany for really, introducing me to everyone. And I want to thank Linda for the partnership also. And it was great I met Tiffany in March at an event in San Francisco where I did a talk about my work with someone who he himself has published a memoir. And he's a former political prisoner in California. So it was an honor to be able to meet her during that conversation. Um, and as she said, I'm a sociologist and I'm a cultural and political theorist. And I invite you to come along with me this evening with an open heart and also a sense of curiosity because I believe when we're curious, it allows our defenses to go down, me included, because then we can ask a lot of questions. And I think that's very important, especially now during this phase of human history that we're in, because we're a collective, a human collective that is going through significant change, right? Significant uprooting of people, of ideas, of cultures. And I would argue that we're on on a journey of awakening, very much in it, and as things are shifting rapidly each day on the news, things are also shifting at a higher rate internally. I think for everyone, I can speak for myself, right? As the external world is shifting, I am too shifting. I even today, I spent the entire day kind of in a very reflective state. I think that's very good for evenings like this because that's kind of where I'm coming from, having a very quiet day. And I think back to, where I was, and I invite you to do the same. Think back to where you were a year ago. And for many of us, our lives have rapidly changed. And if you look closely, it's often during these times of big changes, big losses, that the seeds of both individual and collective liberation are being sown. And it's when we feel like there might be no hope or that tides are shifting too fast, that's our collective calling to hold the line and to release what doesn't resonate or serve us, whether that's personally, professionally, within our families, within ourselves, and to deepen into practices that make us feel at home within ourselves. And for me, as someone who, writes and researches control in all of its forms, I'm also very much interested in how people free themselves, how people free their minds, free their bodies, and free their spirits, because they're all interconnected. And I think, what does that have to do with abolition, right? Which is what I would really like to talk about. What does that mean to me? And what does that mean for our collective where we are now in history? And for me, I believe that at the heart of abolition is the belief that human beings are naturally free. And so we're actually not born to obey. We're born to create. It's quite beautiful when you see children when they're just born too. You can see it even in their movements, right? We're born to create, to care, to dream, to also not really perceive how others see us, right? To just exist as having a sense of value. And it is society through structures of control, like the obvious forms, like prisons, like militarized borders and economic violence, that train us to conform and accept punishment and inequality as normal. But I've also learned in my work that, abolitionist work reminds us that abolition is first an inner journey of self-introspection. And that has to happen first before you can collectively weave for our communities. What does abolition look like for where we live and for our spaces that we've built a life? And so I think that holding up a mirror to the self is how we can unlearn that conditioned obedience and return to a deeper, I would say a more beautiful, freer version of ourselves, both individually and collectively. And I speak to you now in this conversation, importantly, about power as well, right? Because what are we freeing ourselves from? Well, it's powered, often disguised as justice, disguised as legitimate authority, and what it means to resist systems that we actually were never meant to obey. Often, our very first experience with control occurs within our very own families. It occurs within our churches, within our friend circles that might feel like frenemies, actually, when you examine them closely, right? I recently liberated myself from some frenemies, and I tell you the grief that comes. But I was also thinking to myself, like, if I am a true abolitionist and I study control and I can feel how control operates in a passive aggressive way, even amongst people that are supposed to have your back, it's like, how can I stand for that? If I truly value freedom, I have to value my own freedom too. I have to value myself and also trust myself when I notice that things are not in for my best, right? And and see where I do have power. And once I worked through that, it did become liberating, even after the grief, after moving through the grief of feeling alone, right? Then thinking, you know what? Actually, when we liberate ourselves from whether it's ideas that are controlling people or structures, we create space. And within that space, there is a that's when our creativity, that's when our innate humanity can take over and we can decide for ourselves what do we want to invest into that space. I won't even say fill it. It's invest into that space. Um, and so, as I was saying, often this feeling of being contained, um, that's what control really is. It's containment, whether it is a physical cage or it is containment, for example, through, requiring like abstinence in order to belong to a group. You know what I mean? Like, so this is why I find control so interesting. I'm also very interested, as Tiffany was saying, I'm an investigative sociologist, so I'm really interested in how control kind of hides. Like, how is it sneaky versus in your face? And so, because control begins at a young age, and within our own minds, we start to self-censor, self-police, reflecting to ourselves the very structures of control that surround us. And this is because, on a basic level, it is human nature to adapt to survive. And so, if everything around you, from your loved ones to your teachers, to the news, to broader society, is telling you to obey, oftentimes you will. And in a society that regularly rewards conformity, being your authentic self is truly one of the biggest risks that you'll ever take. We are raised in a society where we learn in our schools, our families, our ethnic cultures, that we must follow set scripts that dictate your life path. And if not, you could be treated or perceived or labeled as deviant because, in really what that means is that you're deviating from the what is considered the norm. And so, for example, I will ask to everyone just to think about, right? How many of us were afraid to speak up in class when we were in school because of fear of what other kids might say or how other people might perceive us? Or how many of us have felt the pressure to meet the love of your life within a certain time span, and it has to be in college if you went to college, or just after high school, and you have to get married, and then not too soon after graduation, you have to pop out a couple of kids, or people are looking at you like something's wrong, right? Something must be wrong. And so these life scripts are also marketed to us by not just at home, but by the media, by politicians, by people who position themselves as thought leaders. And this adds more evidence to the message that we must conform. And if you don't follow these scripts, we learn as young children that you not only risk being labeled as weird or potentially being labeled as deviant and pushed out as an outcast, but you could be belittled for your ideas, perpetually misunderstood. And so why is this important? Well, it's important first because one, right, this is a typically a very painful experience. And this is how control works. Pain is one of the best controlling mechanisms that you can instill, whether it is physical, or actually a lot of really groundbreaking research has shown that emotional pain is especially um, effective. Emotional pain such as loneliness, isolation. It's why in some of the earliest research, right, on like timeout, these notions of discipline that we use with children, of isolating people, it was shown to be very effective. And it's because yes, you can spank or you can hit someone, but if you isolate them routinely, then you are inflicting a type of emotional harm that really is very difficult for their self-worth to recover, whereas the body can try to recover and make sense of what's going on physically. And so I think for many people in life, as you go through life, right, our life is designed so that it's very easy to not notice this control structure and how it really does network every area of our life, whether or not you've ever been in contact with formal institutions of control like the criminal legal system. And so people have to ask themselves as you move through life, will I conform to other people's expectations and shrink myself to be accepted, or avoid punishment? Or will I go out on my own and trust that those who are meant to be in my life to support my vision and my authenticity will find me? And something that I, love to tell and to say is just that once once you gather the courage to truly follow your vision and embody your authentic self, you'll be in truly for the most rewarding ride of your life. It will be scary and lonely, but it is also very rewarding because often that phase is temporary. It's not permanent. And I can say that for my own life in terms of every milestone or, recovery from something that was heinous has been preceded by many crossroads, having to make these decisions about will I choose to feel free within myself as someone who values where freedom is a at the forefront of my values, or will I, keep my head down? Um, and so we've all come together tonight in honor of a shared commitment to racial justice. And with that comes a commitment to freedom. And we bring with us our own varied experiences. And within those experiences is truly a particular wisdom that we all have to share. And it is from your courage and your unique wisdom. That is the place from which your abolitionist constellation forms. And what is that, right? What is it also, too, that we are abolishing? Well, we are abolishing the shadows or systems of gendered and racialized control that seek to control and regulate every facet of our daily lives, from our breath to our choices to efforts that limit our imagination and worldview. And so let's ground this in something very familiar, which is the school to prison pipeline, for instance, that disproportionately targets children of color, particularly Black, Indigenous, and Latinx children from an early age. And disciplining deviance turns into criminalization. And immigration systems also operate as parallel prisons. Another parallel is the native boarding school system, similarly operates in a way of deploying this logic of who's undesirable, who needs to be readjusted, and who's deviant and needs to be fixed. And that is the way that I see these systems because of my research and work on prisons, and then especially with my book of study in California. And something that I found quite shocking in that work was just how many concrete connections there truly are between the way that California prisons, for well over a century, that I can prove, have tried to systematically readjust the mental and physical state of incarcerated people and using incarcerated people as test subjects for how do you create docile human beings? How do you reconfigure someone's body? In particular, I document in my book extensively, and really bring to the light someone that had faded away from history, who should not fade away from history. We should never forget him, but his name was Dr. Leo Stanley, and he performed over 10,000 experiments, 10,000 human experiments on incarcerated men trying to fix their failing masculinity. And he very explicitly argued, from his during his tenure from 1913 to 1951 when he retired, that the epitome of masculinity was a white heterosexual man, and that he that was his ideal. And so through these human experiments, he was trying to transform incarcerated men into that ideal and see if he could cure them. And his research has had significant and lasting effects because it is during that heyday, right? This is the same time when psychiatric hospitals are trying to do something similar with people that are committed. Um, Similarly, right, the same thing is happening and had already been happening for at least a generation in indigenous boarding schools, in terms of trying to readjust the minds of populations that were deemed undesirable and the bodies, right? Through all of these techniques. It's what when I teach my students this at USC, I teach a class basically on like inmateization, like how do you create an inmate, whether it's a prison, a school, a boarding school, or a psychiatric hospital, and we learn what you do. And what you do is it's you'll see when I tell you some of the examples, it's you create something as simple as like assigned seating removes a type of agency. And schools use this because it has been used on other populations that were actually physically confined in bars to show that it works. Something simple as taking away your choice of where you're going to put your body because your body is confined then to a little space. And so that we see that with children, why when we have this very traditional model of being confined to the desk, right? Many children actually that doesn't work well. That doesn't work well. That's not like actually how they learn best. It's how they are more likely to face um, demonization and labels for their inability to sit still, when we now know that physiologically, like little children are not actually meant to just be sitting still for hours and hours. Um, and you know, Another thing that I found very interesting in my work in the archives all over California, especially when I was investigating this doctor, because I didn't even know he existed, to be honest. When I went out, started this over a decade ago, I just discovered him. And as I discovered him, I started to understand, wow, like he was truly celebrated during his time, but even now, if you look him up through the Department of Corrections, at least when I last cataloged it, which was in 2018, so they could have heard one of my talks and updated how they refer to him, but they said, like once is basically once celebrated doctor with a complicated past who contributed significantly to medical research. And it's like, no, he doesn't have a complicated past. Like he was a eugenicist. He agreed with Hitler, and the Nazis at the time actually saw that as a model in terms of like experimentation. And he used that in California on all incarcerated people that he could get his hands on, and he got at least 10,000. during his time. And he was a huge proponent of racial segregation because of the natural deviance as someone's skin tone got darker. And he was also very much a proponent of he was coming out of that legacy of like skull charts and the types of charting, scientific charting, which is really it's pseudoscience. And that's something I still continue to argue today is that the systems of control that we have in California, things like gang databases, for instance, actually come from that legacy. If and I've traced it far enough back, they come from this legacy and then what comes next, which is the adjustment center era. Once he retires, the Department of Corrections creates an entire wing within different prisons, and they're called adjustment centers, which is Orwellian, but that's what they're still called. Where you, if you were identified as being particularly troublesome, which first started out being people that were considered psychotic, or people that were LGBTQ, people who just like look that seemed off, and that was very subjective by the Department of Corrections, you could be disappeared into these adjustment units. What I found interesting, especially in my book, was not just tracing that lineage, showing then, well, how did they make this big leap from there to people's political views? And it actually wasn't a big leap at all. It was only a couple years. The earliest bulletin I could find was 1958, where in Sacramento, prison officials had they sent out a bulletin saying we need to start paying special attention to essentially Black incarcerated people with political beliefs that were aligning with the ongoing civil rights movement of the time. And that really opens the door for this very widespread net of who's a problem, who needs to be readjusted mentally and physically. And then hopefully the goal is we can send them back out into the general population, but that's not what I saw in my records. I saw that people were getting indeterminate sentences where they had to go and like try to perform in front of a disciplinary board. And someone could, by the time, we get into the 60s, they could say, well, are you a Black Panther? And someone's like, I am. You're getting sent back to the adjustment center because clearly the adjustment center didn't work, right? Um, so in my book, which is documenting this and also just for me even awakening so many connections and seeing how all of these systems of control that I'm discovering in California prisons are having these concrete connections to these other sites of control and then even to schools in terms of how do we create more docile children, right? Um, that was a light bulb for me about what does it actually mean when we're talking about abolition and how I believe that it truly starts at home. It starts at home in our home communities as well, because you have to be able to truly see the ideas and the labels that we accept at home first to see them clearly in your own life and own community before you can really see them for other people or people who have been who someone could be predisposed to judge because they have a criminal label, right? And so um this is why I think it's very important to think broadly. So in my book, as I was saying, I use prisons as this case study to show that prisons are tools of governance and built to isolate, and also built to neutralize resistance using these pseudoscientific means that are truly coming out of eugenics. They're coming out of settler colonialism, which is it is a societal structure of going to another land. I'm putting it very basically, but going to another land, being Christopher Columbus and declaring that there's nobody really here and that we have to civilize this land. Prisons are are have been explicitly used as a tool to dominate the native population and whoever was, um, I would say, stolen. So if you were, descended from enslaved Africans, stolen from their indigenous lands and brought to a new land. So within that, that is how our schooling systems, even our religious institutions, our prisons, our detention centers, um, all of these are being constructed in this new land, right? With this logic in mind. And that is at the base level, without me having a very lengthy history lesson as to why, even though I was shocked when I started finding these concrete connections across sites, I really shouldn't have been shocked, actually. It just like, even though I was like, oh my gosh, that's that eugenicist doctor and this and like the school system. And then I'm like, but no, no, because they're operating under this logic. Um, but even still, I still stand by my point that we were never meant to obey. And what I mean by that is just because something has been occurring for decades, centuries, and it appears to be natural and legitimate, doesn't mean that it is. Because it is through this self-justification that prevents people from questioning. It's like, there's a self-justifying, well, we should exist. Well, but should you? Are you actually working for the public good? Are you actually making people feel safe? People feel seen? I love when other social scientists do research on what actually makes people feel happy and feel like they're in community. And it's not these systems of control that I am outlining in terms of what makes people feel that way. And so now my own question is something I really want to do next, especially from giving talks about my book, is I love asking people, like, what makes you feel free? Um, if you sit with that question. And I might actually start using it with my students because I often have them keep a journal and do kind of brain dumps to see what comes out. And I'm curious what they would say to that question and see how it might change over time if they keep adding to their journal entry. So as I'm coming toward, I have a little bit left to say, but I wanted to read a little bit from my book if that's okay. And I want to because I love that this is a California audience, a Bay Area audience, because I want to read a quote from a woman that I spent a lot of time with. I interviewed her over dinner and she was very lively. I used a pseudonym for everyone because some people you could potentially guess who they are. If you know enough about this history, you might guess. Um, but I interviewed her and I asked her all of these, questions about, why did you join a revolutionary struggle in the Bay Area in California? Like, why did you do that? There's so many other things that you could have been doing. I just posed it like that, like, why did you do that? She's like, well, and I'll read this in the quote, but it was so fascinating to understand her own personal awakening, right? Because everyone can do a revolutionary act in their community, and it doesn't always involve joining an organization and joining a revolutionary organization, but you can do revolutionary acts in your own life, in your own house. And I would argue that that's enough because I truly believe also in the butterfly effect in physics. Everything that you do does ripple. And so, but I will say, I think it's really telling to think through for this person in particular and the generation she's speaking for, why did she end up joining this group in California and feel like that was the only way to liberate her community from these control structures that I've talked about? And so I'm quoting, she said, and I write, particularly for the younger cohort, joining Black revolutionary struggles in California became a way to fight back against new versions of the same carceral apartheid that their families fled in the southern states. During that time, I first met Anthony. I also began to connect with several members of Black political organizations who had joined in the 1960s. And through this network, I met Avery, a high-ranking leader in the original Black Panther Party, who explained to me in an interview this sentiment in the context of Oakland. And she said, and I quote, Oakland is probably very much the ideal place because Oakland had been an all-white city up until the 40s, when during the Second Great Migration, blacks came to Oakland, as they did to Chicago, whatever, from the South, mostly in this case, Louisiana and Texas, to work on the docks and to answer the call of Kaiser to come and build ships, what have you. So Oakland went from being a white city to an almost half black city in like one generation. And in the South, where you had the main part of the movement where the majority of Black people had been living, the whites were so violent and vicious in the South. And wasn't nobody going to talk about, well, I'm just going to go here and do this and that? Nobody would have thought that. In the North, like Philadelphia, Baltimore, older cities, people had settled in ghettos and they had made their peace. We could say with this white world and black world, but they weren't under the gun because you could vote in Philadelphia, but you couldn't go to the beach. There were some theaters you couldn't go to, some restaurants you couldn't go to, so there was segregation. But you could still live your life in Philadelphia or New York. You couldn't do that in the South. Now, why is this important? Because who joins the Black Panther Party are the people who are living in the North because they're already disconnected from the Klan. So they don't have that fear. They don't have that fear of the Klan. But now they have a consciousness. Who is going to let somebody from the North, who's going to let somebody beat them up and you just sit down and take it? So you had the urban generation of Northern and you had some Philadelphia and so forth. But on the other end here, this was Huey Newton and Bobby Seale's first generation that grew up in the North. Their parents had still had Southern attitudes and Southern ideas, understanding the Klan murders and all that. But generally, the majority of blacks had lived in the South. And the Great Migrations came because what? We were looking for work and we couldn't find it in the South. So we walked. And in some cases to Detroit, we walked to Chicago, so forth and so on. And those people that settled in the West Coast were actually different from the East Coast, who had been entrenched in life in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. Those are old cities. Blacks had been living in those cities for a long time. This was a new group of blacks on the West Coast, end quote. And I think, Avery's take on her time in the movement and her life and it's so powerful, but it's so interesting when I compare that with other stories of migration that I heard and that I tell in this book. And so for instance, a parallel to Avery is I also excuse me, I interviewed a man named Andrew who he too migrated with his family to California. Andrew was white or is white. As a young kid, he was in Chicago. He grew up in a working class neighborhood and saw himself as a poor white. That's what he said. And he said he was surrounded by kids of all races. He was like, there was Puerto Rican kids, black kids, Mexicans, like we were all friends. We were all poor together. And then he's like, I got to California, he eventually becomes incarcerated. And it was truly through Andrew I understood, and through other stories, so many people had these migration stories of the same time, but had very different ends. Um, and in particular, Andrew becomes a card-carrying white supremacist during his incarceration. He becomes a member of the Aryan Warriors because he's incarcerated in Nevada. He goes to California. He has his run-ins with the Aryan Brotherhood. And so through him, I'm really able to understand too, how did someone go from playing with other impoverished children of different races to being, when I met him, he was, much older. He had like a silver streak and he's covered in tattoos and has swastikas on his hands. And in that experience, he told me, he's like, now that I'm out, I don't need all of this. Basically saying, like, now that I'm not in a California prison, I don't I don't need all of this because out here, like, we we're all working. And he motioned behind him because there was other formerly incarcerated men behind him that were working. And he's like, we all are working on the same common good. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? He's like, well, some of those guys in there, they wrote me letters when I was incarcerated, when I was a lifer that found out because of legal changes, I had a chance at getting out. And they wrote me letters, and I didn't care that, he wrote me letters and he's a former Crip. I don't care that he's a former Crip. He's writing me letters trying to help me understand the process if I get out. And so that was so powerful for me, this understanding of truly how our prisons, not just how they truly create um, many of the problems and distinct racial warfare that we see on the news. I document in my book and show that is often manufactured and instigated by corrupt correctional officers and by institutional policy. So as I come kind of bringing it to more toward the end, and I have a few more things to say. Again, back to this question of what is it that we're abolishing within our own lives, within our particular belief systems, and also externally, outside of these informal institutions of control, but formal institutions of control that claim to rehabilitate, but I have seen and shown consistently in all of my work, not just my book, that do not succeed at doing so. Um, and so I take inspiration from abolition in terms of its historical context, not just in the contemporary. And so historically, abolition in the United States, right, comes from abolitionists who were working against chattel slavery. That is where, the thinking and the terminology comes from. And also, it is very fitting because of the concrete connections between chattel slavery and mass incarceration in our prison system, which I could definitely talk about in Q&A. I have so many very like they're not fun facts. They're like sad, they're like difficult facts that I know from my work of connecting these systems very concretely and not as metaphor. But I think that, in thinking through lessons from ancestors that were abolitionists, what can we learn from them? And abolitionists like Harriet Tubman, right? She's often remembered as a freedom fighter, but she was also a very skilled celestial navigator. And that's where we can get this linkage of abolitionist constellations, right? Because they extend this legacy and they're not just poetic imagery. It's like they're actually abolitionist constellations are living networks of resistance, of survival, of direction, and it have long guided people through darkness and through dark times. Enslaved people in particular, right, followed the Big Dipper or the drinking cord to freedom on the Underground Railroad. Um, but importantly, Harriet Tubman, as she reflected on leading enslaved peoples to freedom, famously said, and I quote, "If I could have convinced more slaves that they were slaves, I could have freed thousands more," end quote. And I think we can unpack that maybe together. But I think that in thinking through that quote, it also, for me, brings up the writing of Frantz Fanon and his writing on colonialism, where he talks about the psychological impacts of colonialism, or even Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois here, right, who's a founding sociologist of of my discipline, who wrote about the social psychological wage of whiteness in particular, and why it's so powerful to not just be perceived or be white, but to barter in whiteness. And he's really the one that gifted us with this knowledge of like someone doesn't have to be white to barter with whiteness to gain power. And so, I think that thinking of this mental component of what does it mean to obey? What does it mean to obey and to not question all of these structures that we take for granted? Because if we are going to question our prison system, which is a structure that is based on cultural ideals and beliefs, then we have to question all of the cultural ideals and beliefs that we just live with. And it doesn't mean like you may not come to the conclusion that everything in your life needs to be abolished, but I normally what I see is people do come to conclude do begin to think about, things do need to change in certain institutions, in certain aspects of life. And so what I call abolitionist constellations, it's something that it's bigger. It's this long held connection of resistance and people resisting and movements resisting. And we truly, if we look I'm sure in our own communities and then, around us and even broader out, we see abolitionist constellations forming all around us and especially crystallizing during moments of repression. It's actually there's a one of the best social theories I think it's just a very simple theory on the dialectics of repression and resistance, and it's one of the most simple social theories of all time. It's just that if you repress, you are going to be met with resistance, and then you're going to be repressed, and that's just argument. It's just going to go back and forth. And so within this thinking, I think for many communities are facing significant repression. Repression that I have long studied and often had people tell me like the things that was saying was overblown. Like in the past, people would say to me, no one gets disappeared anymore. And I would say, well, then you are blessed to be in a community where no one has ever been removed by plainclothes officers and no one knows where they went, right? Or have been disappeared once they're incarcerated and not heard from. And in my research, that's probably because they're in the adjustment center. So I say that unfortunately because now we are in a time where more and more people now, I think, are open to hearing some of the things that I say and not immediately saying, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. And realizing that, and I think that just to close, I think in the work of community organizations such as this one, it's so important because one of the first steps to awakening is bringing people together to have conversations about unlearning structures of control and reimagining what allyship looks like in the creation of a new world and new community structures. And that for me also is another value of freedom. It's that I welcome these types of conversations because I am not trying to push my energy or space into someone else's, right? I have my words that welcome respect, but I also respect other people's words and experiences. And often when I see big conflict, or even if I see conflict between my students, I say, "Oh, I can see that you all are not listening to each other." Like I can hear what that person is trying to say about what their needs are, and I can hear what this other person is trying to say about what their needs are, but we're not at a place yet where you all are hearing each other. And so I do think that these types of spaces are incredibly important. Because for me too, because of what I study, I often end up studying hate. It's just what I have to study. And what I see is that um, often deep down when you deconstruct, right, what it takes for someone to get all the way to the place where, right, where someone has a swastika on their hand, what I have seen that at first it starts with someone, for instance, in the example of Andrew that I brought up, you know, when he described to me his full life, because I do life history interviews for this reason, because I don't want to just talk about his present and who he is in present. It's, he said to me, he's like, when I think about it, and I spent a lot of time in Pelican Bay, and when I was there thinking about it in isolation, my first experience with solitary was actually as a child, being locked away by my stepfather in a closet. And like people knew that he was abusing my sisters. He would lock me away so I couldn't help them. And like nobody intervened. And right, without having these types of conversations and going back, it's like it would be very easy to just see him as, oh, he's like, he was a white supremacist gang member. But it's like because of taking the time to get to know him and understand him, and then also understand his process of like disavowing all of that, it just gave me a much clearer picture on control, how our society really is positioned to groom people to hate, um, and what can we do to move forward to promote more cohesion and true understanding. So I will end there so that we have time for people to, I'm just curious, like share what maybe came up for you, your reflections, and if you have any questions. But thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can just feel free or thoughts. Yeah, just to unmute yourself and go
Thank
for
you.
it.
Yeah, I'm rooting around for that raise your hand, which always seems to move on Zoom. Thank you, Dr. Friedman, for writing the book and for sharing it with us tonight. I wanted to ask you a question about um, a transformation that's taking place at San Quentin prison here, very, very close to where I'm sitting right now. And I was really, interested in this transformation, which is to um, transform San Quentin into a rehabilitation center. And I wanted to, see about getting involved. And, I was particularly interested in the retraining of correctional officers to be more relational with inmates. But then as I started to educate myself about the abolitionist movement, I thought, well, I don't know if I want to be a part of this at all, and I just wondered what your thoughts are about, is it just attenuating a, an apartheid system to try to reform something that is, inherently unjust.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate that question. And the first reaction I have is that I do believe, and from my work with formerly incarcerated people, especially many of the people I have worked with have served sentences from 20 to 40 plus years. So
Or,
um
yeah, whole adult lives.
mhm. And some people I've worked with, they went in as juveniles and they received LWOP sentences and were able to get out with legal changes here in California. But I from that work, I have learned from them that, programs that support incarcerated people are very important, right? And not the I wouldn't say the retraining of correctional officers, but I will explain to you why I take that stance. I don't think that I think it's very difficult to retrain them, but I will give a concrete example of why. But in terms of programs like, right, like art programs, programs that like support having people's children, more time with people's children, and bringing children to see their parents and spending quality time to try to repair relationships, even if someone's never getting out, right? That's valuable for the child and for the community and for the family. And so I think any type of programming that can support how people, incarcerated people, are spending their time and also connecting people and with their loved ones, I would be rooting for because I think it has significant benefits to people. People are at significant risk of suicide while they're incarcerated because of the psychological and physical effects. And people are human beings, and so for me, it's like this is the least that we could do. And there's many great studies that have been done on other country systems that show that having this type of programming is only a bonus. And that's something too that people spoke to me, especially the former lifers. They had such wisdom in their experience because of how many years, right? And they said to me, we lived through the time when we did have programs and that we had so much programming and people, it was almost like an incentive. Like it's like I'm gonna do everything I can do so I can stick to my program. But then, during the really like tough on crime era where we switch into this more incapacitating model where we're just funneling as many people as we can, casting a wide net. And also another layer of my work, the Captive Money Lab that I co-founded, is looking at the financial incentives of incarceration. So beyond like what we hear of like we need more prisons because the crime rate's up. Like my other work shows using FOIA, which I love, to get like I've gotten emails from public officials, and legislative debates are public, but sometimes you do have to FOIA for them in certain states. But like just reading through those and seeing, oh, this is like a business model. Like publicly, they're telling the public this is making you safer and we're building more prisons because of crime. But in your closed conversations, you're, lobbying for lease revenue bonds, which is like an innovation to fund. Like you're saying we need to increase this many beds. And so that tells a different story. And lifers, in their experience have talked to me about during that time when they're trying to make money by building more prisons, all their programming's getting cut because they're also trying to save money at the same time. So I always would advocate for any type of programming. Um, and then in terms of training correctional officers, I don't think it would be effective. And the reason I say that for California is so when I was talking about Dr. Leo Stanley and how he retires and then California switches in 1953 to the adjustment center model of readjusting people psychologically and physically, that unit especially was supposed to train and basically pull the best and brightest correctional officers that were going to be the most humane. It was supposed to, and that center, that whole logic was supposed to be therapeutic. And as soon as it opens, it becomes a house of horrors. It becomes like the place where no one wants to go. And I've seen in some of my talks, like people have come up to me and said, like, when I was incarcerated, I'll use San Quentin because we're close. Someone close to me that I didn't know. I knew he was in San Quentin, um, but I didn't know he was in the adjustment center. And after he read my book and I gave the talk, he was like, I was in the adjustment center. And everything that you describe, that's what it is. And so I think yes, if you can volunteer your time and effort and also advocacy for programming, especially, people I've talked to, like educational programming is high on the wants. Art is very high on the wants. Writing classes, very high. Any sort of creative outlet. Um, so and I do know one, not a nonprofit in LA, but I know there's some great ones in the Bay. but I know one in LA in particular that like has an awesome program, especially for lifers, with art that is run by a nun. So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, I feel very skeptical about the retraining of correctional officers because of that's what they did try to do with that model. And I spoke to people and interviewed people for my book that lived through those adjustment centers, and they were tortured in there. So
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Brittany, actually, in kind of following on what Robin said about corrections officers, in your book, you talk about the extra legal policies and correction officers aligning themselves with white supremacist groups. So I think in a way that sort of, can you just share a little bit about that and how that is built into the systems and how California, even though people are like, oh, California is so liberal, it's not like the South, but the California prison system is the one that started, most of these awful practices and became sort of like what is the word like for other prisons to follow, their tactics or whatnot.
Yes, absolutely. So, it's something that California definitely does get touted, I think, a lot as being like a reform state or a model for how to do prisons better. But I always say no, like in my work, I have found that, the reason California was so interesting to me because I was first trying to understand why does California have all of the major prisoner groups that then become, you know, categorized by the Department of Corrections as major security threat groups, like prison gangs. How does that happen in one state? Because it is actually abnormal. It's a very interesting puzzle, and that's really how I first started, is that I was like, this doesn't make sense. Why California? Then in my work, I found that, this legacy of um, trying to adjust people, and really the Department of Corrections targeting, especially in the 50s, of incarcerated Black people that were um, seen as being aligned with the civil rights movement, using these strategies of readjustment on them really was like the kicking point. Because once that happened officially and formally through those centers, through other formal means of surveillance, and what I found interesting was that it didn't stop there. That correctional officers, they basically use the age-old tactic of aligning with civilian white supremacists. So everything that we have learned about the United States and the history of law enforcement and the Klan being one and the same, I discovered in my research in for this book. And I didn't just discover it like in the archives, I discovered it in across my interviews. And that's what I found interesting, is that even interviews with people that were a part of white supremacist groups during their incarceration were like, yeah, like the officers, like they favor us. They give us knives. Like they give us all this stuff, and it's because they're seen as being like hitmen. And as I argue in my book, it's hitmen for what? Well, it's the civil rights movement was so profoundly important for the origin story for these major groups that we now know to come out of California. Because once you have, the legacy of the Great Migrations radically transformed the California population. Other scholars have shown how incarceration becomes a major tool to swoop up, right? People, Black people in particular, Latinx people, Indigenous people in California, and how it intensifies as the numbers increase. And then my work shows, well, what happened to them when they were incarcerated? And that's what I found very interesting. I'm like, it's very much like a racial threat story of like during this time, it's like, oh, their numbers are increasing. So I have some great quotes of like, there's more of them. What are we gonna do? And this very concrete alliance that formed, it wasn't a metaphor. Like it's not this metaphor of like, oh, the police are like the Klan. It's like, no, I'm like in California, they were a team. And in the contemporary, we still have concrete instances that show that allyship that is like a strategic one, it reappears during moments of need, is what I would argue is a strategic one. Just like any sort of because I'm also a political sociologist and as a historical sociologist, and so I think of these things as like politically, what how are people aligning themselves? Um, and so thank you for that question, Tiffany. That has been a tool of the US settler colonial framework since this country's inception has been for either law enforcement or military to align themselves with white supremacist civilians to overtake usually a non-white population and either seize their property, massacre them, or incarcerate them. And so that's what I show in my book simultaneously happened when people were on the inside. So it's like a rep prisons are really just like a replication often of the outer world, but it's more intensified because you're within a cage.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yes.
And then everyone, we have about 5 more minutes. So if anyone has something they would like to share, a reflection or a question for Dr. Friedman, now is a good time.
I have a question. I was also looking for that raise hand button, but I couldn't find it. But you can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry I joined late, so apologies if you have touched on this. But recently I read the book That Bird Has My Wings by Jarvis J. Masters, who is on death row in San Quentin, innocent. And so it's his memoir, and he came of age in the 70s. And part of his story is the juvenile detention centers in LA and being and the physical abuse that happened there. And we did this in a book group, and part of what we thought was like, I mean, it was so egregious and horrific, and of course, as everything in this category is, but to read his personal story of it, and we thought, but the juvenile centers must be reformed now. Like, I mean, this was in the 70s, and it was, the gladiator style fighting and the just and that kind of thing. And then, so that was sort of, and we talked about a lot of other things in his story. But just yesterday was a headline in the New York Times that says LA probation had to just pay 2.7 million settlement to a juvenile who was used, put in a gladiator style fight. So it looks like people have seen this. So I'm just wondering, in your research, is this the norm or is this the outlier? This kind of very, very intentional with youth, with kids. How prevalent is that?
So thank you so much for that question. It's routine. So that's what I argue in my book is that it's an extra legal tool of control that's routine, especially in California, but it's actually routine nationwide. So other colleagues of mine that study other state systems, also juvenile systems, they encounter this routinely. And so I with California, that case, I'm still working on the piece, but I've been asked to write about it in a public piece because a lot of people that I interviewed survived gladiator fights, and were forced to participate in them as adults. And so I've been asked to write about essentially, help dissuading any sort of public idea that like this is a one-off case, and also bringing in previous cases that, as you were saying, that made headlines decades ago, like Corcoran, and like other cases where that gladiator fighting it's a routine way to control incarcerated people because um well, for one, it's often it's allowed. It's allowed because it instills terror. And also, historically, gladiators they were prisoners of war. And almost every prison system that I like to read about prisons in history, just even ancient prisons. Gladiator fighting is a routine technique, whether it's legal Or in my book, as I show, I describe it as extra legal because it isn't legal in the United States, but it is done. So thank you for that question. And it's even with children. And in that case, one of the children, I think I read the indictment that came out in March. Um, and I believe they were able to prove at least 140 fights and with children as young as 12. And so that just tells you, right, just like the level of depravity that's built into the system and normalized. Um, and again, points to like I have a lot of skepticism about I have skepticism about reforming like the officer style training. Like I think we have to create an entirely new system to, especially for children when dealing with harm. Like it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And one of the ways I like to teach my students this that they're always shocked is we go through the Stanford prison experiment because then they will tell me like, oh, but like, I could be really well-meaning. And I'm like, no, but like socially and psychologically, um, institutions have long studied how to best control people and how to take an everyday person that's well-meaning and make them into like an enforcer. And so we go through it to teach them that. And, that's the system that we have for our kids. So yeah,
Mm.
it's horrible.
Yeah, the depravity, that was the word I was looking for, I think too. Yeah, thank you for that explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think you can the LA Times showed some video if you but it's hard to watch, but you can see like in the video some of the officers are like high-fiving like the children that like win in this fight where I believe it was like 6-1 that they had set up. Um
Yeah, that's
so
the New York Times described. And there was a settlement that this 2.7 million, which seems like seems like chump change. But I guess the settlement is. Thank you.
yes, Tammy.
That that just kind of brings me to something that was kind of reverberating in my mind, which is that when you're talking about how we can train ourselves to be or be trained by others to be controlled, there is also something inherent in being the controller that brings out, as you're saying, kind of that aspect in humanity. And I think our police systems are designed to encourage that. When I was a former criminal defense attorney and now work with police reform. And, you can see it so clearly, these people who think they're the good guys, but are doing these just horrific things uh, because they are told that controlling people is a good practice. That's what they're there for. And it's just, so I don't know what you think about. Are there ways of other than, I mean, we all like to eliminate policing and start over with a service model, but between here and there, how can you diminish that kind of setting and mindset that we put officers into that brings out these horrific behaviors in them?
Well, I think that it first we would have to do it would have to be a complete overhaul, which I don't think would happen, but it would have to be a complete overhaul of even just the underlying assumptions and belief systems that are coming out of scientific research about how do you best control people. And what I mean by that is I think so so I'll give an example again of like how I was saying that with my students in that class on inmatization, or really it's like how do you strip someone down to create that type of power dynamic. And as you're saying too, it is it's the exact same power dynamic you see between police on the outside and a civilian, right? This authority divide. And so I teach my students, I say, well, I ask them, I say, what's the first thing you would do? And they say, well, I don't know. I guess I wouldn't call them by their name. And I'm like, why? And they're like, because if I call someone by their name, then it gives them a sense of like individuality. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. So that's why you have a number. You don't have a name anymore, you have a number. And if you do have a name, you might be called by your last name, but usually you have a number. And if you ask anyone who's ever been in any type of containment, they remember their number because you're forced to remember it by heart and recite it as though it's you. And so we go through these tactics, and it's similar with police. You see in their training, I have several colleagues who study police officers and who have had somehow, I think because they were students when they started the work, but they were able to like get in to do actual ethnographies of police training and follow and ride along with them and follow and see how they're actually trained day by day and not just like written policies. And that socialization process um, is just so interesting. One of my colleagues, his book on that, it's called The Danger Imperative. And I recommend it because he compared three police departments from across the country to show similarities. And he found that the commonality was that they were all being trained to think the worst case scenario at all time, to always see people no matter what. So he gives several examples of ride-alongs where like officers are talking to children in their car, but the kids can't see, but the officer is just holding like onto their gun. And afterward, he'd be like, "Why are you holding your gun? You were talking to an elementary school kid." And then they would say, "Well, you never know. Like we're trained that you always have to be prepared." And so, like in his work, he is showing, that this hyper preparedness, that is when you pair that with the militarization of our police force, it creates almost like a psychological shield where like they get to a point where they act with by the time they get into the public as a rookie, they can't really see you, like is what his one of his findings are, and then how it's reinforced over time, like through from going from a rookie to becoming seasoned. It's reinforced because it is a dangerous profession in the sense of that they are going to encounter dangerous things over time. But in his work, it's just really profound because he shows like how certain dangers are overlooked, like how like a significant number of officers die because they're not wearing their seatbelt, like during a chase, versus like putting on the seatbelt but holding a gun when you're talking to little kids is more important, even though seatbelt deaths in some years like could outpace other types of particular police deaths. So I think he's just the point really is that I I think that it's difficult to reform training when the training is rooted in these psychological techniques that are designed to dehumanize civilians, to where you don't really see people anymore over time. And that actually is a part of the training because it's seen as protecting officers if they see you less. So then how do you reach, like, that is so, and that's why I do think his book is powerful, because that finding alone just shows how why there was a case, I think it was in California. I now I'm gonna have to look this up, which state, where a person was accosted by the very same police department that like years ago they had been contracted to do like a diversity training with. And it was like just now this is gonna bother me. I have to look this up. I believe it was California. So yeah, I know that's a long-winded answer, but I think that it has to be a fundamental uprooting because of the dehumanization that is built into how we train authority figures. You even see this, that's again why you see it in schools too. Like all of these rituals of schooling, of like making kids walk in a line, making all these things are actually techniques that are coming out of from scientists that use these same techniques on prisoners of war, incarcerated people in domestic prisons and how you treat someone when you encounter them as a police officer and a civilian to establish dominance. So, and I think a lot of like intellectual bros have tried to like write like this, those types of self-help books that are like dark psychology of like how you assert dominance. It's like, but they're actually pulling from real scientific studies that have been implemented by government agencies. So yeah, it's why I want reforms that help people, but when the reforms are trying to retrain the enforcers, I haven't seen a good model that works on rechanging like that type of mental mindset that people are conditioned to take on as an enforcer. And I think enforcer is a good word. That's really what they're trained to do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman. Thank you for coming this evening. And everyone, thank you for coming as well and for your incredible engagement. This was really amazing. So thanks everyone for joining us. And we're here, the San Anselmo Racial Equity Committee. We meet the first Tuesday of every month at the library. And then also, Brittany, if people want to follow you and follow your work, are there more places they can find you? Also pick up her book too.
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you, everyone. Thanks for your questions and just thank you for, holding space, right? And having conversations that are not always easy. So I appreciate it. You could find me at Curly Professor on most socials. And then my website is brittanyfriedman.com. And then if you want to pick up my book, I would really appreciate it. And if you want, you can get it from a lot of really cool independent booksellers. In the Bay, Marcus Books has my book, and I know you can get it from the store or order it from them. And I think I spoke to the owner, and I think they will ship it actually.
They
Um,
will, yeah.
okay, yeah. So I highly recommend Marcus Books just because it is, I believe, the oldest African American bookstore in the U.S., and it's so cool that it's up there by y'all. So
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman. And thank you
thank
everyone
you.
for coming. This was lovely. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, friends at the library.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye.